Welcome to part 3 of this Serum overview course, and in this section we're going to be talking about some of the most important aspects of the synth, and those would be the oscillators, namely oscillator A, right here, and oscillator B. I will be touching on the sub-oscillator and noise oscillator in a separate video, because I wanted to dedicate a lot of time to discussing these oscillators. So first, let's talk about what Serum is, and it is a two-oscillator wavetable synthesis. I want to give you guys a definition of what wavetable synthesis is, because if you don't understand that, there are certain parts of Serum or certain features that may not make sense, or they may not be as clear as they need to be, so you can create really bomb sounds. So a wavetable synthesis or synthesizer is defined like by a dictionary definition as a synthesis technique that employs arbitrary periodic waveforms in the production of musical tones or notes. Well, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. And I'm a sound designer, so that I'm not going to describe it like that. Here's how I learned to understand what wavetable synthesis is, and the way I explain it's kind of funny, so bear with me. I don't know if any of you have ever made a flip book, like when you're in grade school and you draw someone standing still or stick figure, and then you start to move out their arm slowly, and then as you finish it and you flip through all the pages, his arm is moving up and down. That's kind of what's going on with wavetable synthesis. There's a bunch of different snapshots, or they're typically called frames or cycles, that are pieced together in an audio file that then make up a wavetable. And that wavetable can be flipped through, just like your flip book, by usually moving a knob called a wavetable position. So if you see this little yellow line here, here's our wavetable I have loaded up. As I move this wavetable position, you'll see the yellow line move. Well, it's flipping to the different pages or the different frames or cycles of that wavetable. And if I go to Serum's wavetable editor, which is one of the coolest features in the synth, and we'll be covering that in a later video in this course, you can actually see the individual frames that make up this wavetable. So there are 256 of them in this specific wavetable. So if I play a note right now, let me turn up Serum real quick, and I start to cycle through, you'll see that the frames are cycling and the sound changes. All right, that's kind of like the flip book analogy I just gave you. So that's how I understand wavetable synthesis. And the wavetable is typically just a audio file, like a wave file, but they're created in a special manner to kind of allow you to switch through the different parts of that file. And I loaded up one that has a bunch of different snapshots. I know the spectral wavetables, are most of them anyway in Serum, have a lot of frames. So if we go to an initial preset here, let's talk about that. If you see this box, this looks much different than the one I just had loaded up. There's not as much information in this. That's because right now, by default, this is just a single frame waveform. So this is just a saw wave. And there's nothing to really modulate to. See, I'm moving the wavetable position, and it doesn't create any change. So wavetables need to have more than one frame or one cycle to actually create that kind of wavetable sound that we're all used to. Otherwise, it kind of acts just like a virtual analog or subtractive synthesis sound, or you need to actually apply a cutoff filter or LFOs to something to make it have movement and depth. So that's a crash course in wavetable synthesis, in the way I think of it at least. So Serum's really unique because you have tons of wavetables. And the cool thing is it's not a closed back end like, say, Massive is, where you can't change or load up any new wavetables. What you have is what you get. Well, with Serum, that's not the case. You'll see here, and I touched on this a little bit in the first video, or the second video actually, I have Electra X wavetables, which is a synth made by Tone2. I have Code X, which is a waves synth, and then I have Massive. So you can actually download, export whatever you want, and use any wavetables your heart desires in Serum. So that's one of the coolest features of it. So start talking about how these oscillators function. So to turn them on, you click this little blue button, or you can click in the words. You can't click anywhere in the gray, that doesn't work, but if you click on Os A, the word, it'll still illuminate and turn on and off. So by default, when you open a new preset, it'll typically just be the oscillator A, and that's it, and it'll be this saw wave. Moving down in this box, you will see where it says default. Now this is where you can click on this and it will pull down your drop-down menu of all the different wavetables that come with Serum, or might be even ones that you add to it by third party or add to your user file, whatever it may be, at a later point. And then these arrows, like if I load up an analog 4088 and I go this, it'll load up the next one. It keeps going down the list. And now if I go back a couple times, we'll get back to that 4088 one that we just loaded. And moving down even further, here are your pitch controls inside of the oscillator. And each oscillator has these exact same controls. So once we know and understand how one works, it's the same for both of them. So you have your octaves. Let me play this wavetable. It goes down 4 and up 4 octaves, so quite a bit of range. Then you have your semitones. Now this would be where you would stack things to make your chords. So I could add a sub oscillator right now and tune this to 7, and we would have... I'm sorry, let me tune this one to 7, and we'll leave this one obviously to 0 because you don't have that control, and then I can tune this to 3. Now we have a minor chord. So there's kind of how you can start to envision doing those deep house or house type chord stacks. We turn off oscillator B now. And then you have your fine pitch. So this is going to be moving in cents, which is a much less noticeable pitch drift to our ear than obviously semitones. It goes down to -100 and up to 100. And then you have this, it's this coarse pitch. Now this is really interesting. It's a pitch transpose that's not going to snap to semitones or really even cents. It's just kind of, it's very minute. So this sounds really cool with sound effects and sweep effects. It can be subtle and it can be very dramatic, as you just heard. And it's sometimes a good thing to modulate with an LFO to add some snap or attack to your sounds. Now, moving down into the actual display, if you click on it, it'll toggle back and forth between a single frame view and then kind of this three-dimensional waterfall type view of the whole wavetable. So the difference between them is maybe when you're starting to edit the wavetable position, the single frame view might be a little bit more in depth, or there just might be a little bit more information at your disposal. But also it's a good way to see visually three-dimensional where you can tell, for instance, if I was quizzing you, where would you think on this wavetable there would be the most amount of frequencies represented? Down here, where there's clearly kind of, stuff going from the whole three-dimensional, or where things start to, I guess, pinch off. So let's listen to this and see. So, I mean, there's a little bit more content, high-end content actually at the beginning. So you can't really see that when you start to mess with it here. You can tell that there's a little bit more going on with this part of the wave. This is it's kind of pinching everything together, getting more narrow. So there is benefits to using both of the views, and that is why they are there. And that is where you can also just click on this one right there, and it'll do the same thing, but you don't have to click on the one. You can just click anywhere you like. Next is, let's talk about this little pencil guy. If you click the pencil, it brings up the wavetable editor. Now we're going to be going over this in depth, but I just wanted to let you know now that is where it is and what it does. All right, let's move down to the controls, and let's first start talking about the unison. So I am going to open up a initial preset. So we just have this saw wave. So the unison, it's really cool how visual everything is in Serum. So if I click and just hold, do you see that yellow line right here? That's saying there's one voice that's in the middle. I go to 2, now there's 2 voices, and they're kind of stacked out left and right. If I go 3, now there's 1 in the middle and 2 out to the side. And so forth. And you can drag all the way up to 16. Now, I was just playing that ditty not because I wanted to say, hey, watch me play piano. I wanted to show you how good the unison engine is inside of Serum. I mean, for no filter and just one oscillator, one single wave, single frame oscillator, it's just a saw wave. That sounds dope. It's this thick. Now, I do want to point out that if you're playing a bunch of chords and you have the poly up to 16 in the voicing, again, we'll talk about all this later, and you have 16 voices of unison, This sucker's playing a lot of voices, and it can hit your CPU hard. So if I play a chord, right now, watch this legato down here. It'll tell me how many voices I'm playing. If I move my mouse out of the way so you can see. All right, that's 64 out of a possible 256 how things are currently set up. Just to throw it into perspective, Massive, which is kind of known as being a little bit CPU hungry, can only play 64 voices. So if we add another oscillator, do 16 voices of unison, we'll turn the detune down quite a bit on both of these. And now I'll play that same chord. That's 128 voices. So you can see my CPU up top, and I'm running an 8-core Mac here. So you can see. I mean, it sounds great, but definitely something you'd end up rendering to audio, or at least I would. But this is where you'll be adding your unisons. And then here you have your detune, which is just a standard detune in unison. It's going to set the amount of detune of the unison voices. So if you crank this sucker way up and you have more voices, it's not going to be very musical. Right? Typically you'd have it around under halfway, and the control goes from 0 all the way up to 1. So around 0.20 is where I would say the peak of most musical results are going to be. And then next you have this blend knob. Now this is really cool. This is a really awesome feature that they included. So I'm going to go to 3 voices for this, just to show you. And now let's look at our detune. So you have the 2 voices, see those little 2 green slashes right there, out left and right, and then the middle is the loudest. Well, if I turn this blend up, do you see now the yellow line in the middle is the quietest and the green ones are getting louder? What this is doing is it's kind of like a dry-wet signal, or a level or volume signal of the detuned voices. So you can control how loud you hear either the center voice that still remains or the detuned unison voices. So let's listen to this with the blend all the way up. So I'll play a chord, turning up blend. So I didn't detune the voices anymore, add any more unison voices. I'm just telling Serum, hey, I want to hear more of the detune. So that's a really cool thing to have at your disposal. So let's talk about what the phase is going to do. Now, if this was a sample player like Contact or the EXS24 in Logic, the phase is basically a sample start. So it's going to tell Serum where along your wavetable is when you trigger a note or play a key on your keyboard, that is going to trigger from. So right now, a cool little yellow line flashes across to let you know where that might be. Now, this is helpful when you have 2 of the same sounds in maybe a wavetable. And if you have right now, there should be, let's actually do something I talked about in the first video. I'm going to copy oscillator A to B. All right, so we got the same settings. Now let's listen to this. There's kind of like a phase thing going on when they're both starting from the same point. So if I turn like the phase up on one of them and do that same thing, you can hear that you can start to play with those. And so for certain wavetables, it may not be as noticeable on the default saw wave, but on certain wavetables that might really help. This random, what it does is it sets a random space, and you can see it visually with this little yellow box that will appear. Of every time you hit a key, Serum will tell the oscillator in the random phase to kind of trigger at a different point just within that box. So you can fine tune it to a very narrow band or a wider band depending on your needs for your sound. Now let's talk about one of the heart and soul elements of any oscillator in a wavetable synth, the wavetable position. So we already pretty much touched on this. I'll go over it one more time. So let me load up what is this, Dude Acquire. So what this wavetable position does is it is going to cycle through the different frames. I mean, just throwing on an LFO on your wavetable position can get you wobbles and dubstep growls. Right? So that's you'll be using this a lot inside of Serum if you ever get into actually creating your own presets or tweaking your own. So now let's talk about this kind of knob in the middle of this cluster for the oscillators, and this is one of the coolest features inside of it. This is the warp knob. So for massive users out there, this is where you would choose like spectrum, bend plus, bend plus minus, or minus plus. I forget which one it is at the moment. And then of course your format. So you only have those 5 modes. Well, in Serum, it's that on steroids. I mean, you have a bunch of different things. And you'll see here, you should be familiar with some of it, because the bend plus, the bend minus, the bend plus minus is all there. You have your standard off, which is basically spectrum. So you have everything that you have in massive and then some. And that's typically the theme you'll see here with Serum. So let's go through and start talking about what some of these are doing. If it starts to flow and go well, we'll just cover all of them. So let's start with sync no window. So I'll show you first what it sounds like. All right, so it sounds kind of like a format shift to my ears. It's basically doing a self-synced. It's like it performs it in the oscillator. It's repeating. The wavetable plays and repeats really, really fast, and it starts to pinch off certain frequencies. So it's really helpful for kind of those buzzy, brassy, digital type sounds. So that's the first sync. Now, if you use these arrows, you can start to just toggle through this list. Either the left arrow takes you back to the top, and the right arrow will take you further down towards the bottom. And this knob is the amount of warp you are applying to the wavetable. So let's go on to the other sync modes. Now these are going to sound fairly similar to the first sync. So let me load up one and we'll listen to how it sounds. So this one's much softer sounding, and you don't get that audio degradation that you get at the top end on it. So they're very similar sounding. They're doing a very similar function. Let's talk about bend plus. And for this, I'm going to go to the single cycle. So you can actually, let's pull up a different wavetable so this is easier to see. We'll do a multi-band saw. All right, this will work. So here is the wavetable position. We'll keep it about halfway. And we have it on bend plus. So bend plus will pinch the wavetable. So you'll start to see it pinches everything inwards. See how the left and right is coming in? So let's listen to what that does to the sound. It'll typically brighten things a little. And it's not going to be as noticeable, unfortunately, on this saw, but it's super hard to explain what's going on if I have a wavetable that just has a bunch of information. It's just kind of hard to see that it's all being pulled in because there's too many lines. But let's listen to this just to show you. Got a little bit brighter and buzzier. So we'll go back to that multi-band saw that we were just using. Let's go to bend minus. Now bend minus is going to work in the inverse way. This pulls instead of pinches, and it pulls everything towards the edges of the cycle. So let me move my wavetable position down. So you can see here that it's kind of pushing everything outwards. So let's watch this with a few more parts of the wavetable active. So let's watch it one more time. I'll play a note as I do it. So it's pushing everything out. Now bend plus minus is going to be a combo of the two. It's going to pinch and pull. All right, let's keep on trucking. And then here's an interesting one that's not in massive or too many wavetable soft synths that I've used. It's called PWM, stands for pulse width modulation. This is going to be really helpful on square waves or waves that might be kind of clean sounding like a sine or a square. This isn't going to do a whole heck of a lot to this because it's a multi-band saw, but we'll listen to it anyway. Basically just turns it off. So let me load up a square wave. All right, what's this? So you can hear that it is doing the pulse width modulation effect to it. And like I said, that's going to be most prominent on a square or even, let's load up Let's load up a... All right, an analog sine. Let's see what this does. Yeah, so on a saw wave, it's not going to do a whole lot, unfortunately, but that's not its intended purpose. So let's go on now to the next one using this arrow. It is ASIM Plus. Now this one is going to be similar sounding to the bend, but it's going to take the whole waveform over instead of just part of it. So let's watch. So see, this whole thing now is moving towards the right. So it's pinching the whole thing in. So let's listen. So to my ear, it's like a very subtle bend plus. Now the ASIM minus is going to be similar to the bend minus, but again, the whole thing's going to go towards actually the move over from the left. All right, let's go to ASIM plus minus. That's going to be a combo of those two. I'm not going to talk about that. Flip is an interesting one. Let's listen to what flip does. So it's creating a inverse signal, so it's a polarity flip technically. All right, let's go to the next one, which is mirror. Now this is going to do a mirror version, so it's going to turn things kind of on its head. So it kind of has an octave-esque type sound because it's flipping things, which is really cool, I think. I like that one a lot. Then you have Remap 1. Now I saw, or I was reading on a forum actually for Serum what this actually is because I got intrigued. So you'll see right away when you click on this remap. Let me get this off. Right when you click on the remap, go from mirror to remap, a magnifying glass appears. And when you click it, you get this visual kind of LFO editor. Where you can start to manipulate your wavetable in a multitude of ways using this visual editor, which is really cool. I mean, you have all your controls that you have in the LFO tool or certain things. So I just drew a whole new shape. So we can draw like this is kind of like a pinched pulse wave multiband saw. Right, so it's really easy, really cool to use. Well, what this is basically the creator of Serum, Steve Duda, and hopefully I'm not mispronouncing his name. I apologize if I am. Well, he, I guess, left this in there. This was a way that he was making certain wavetables. Instead of using math and code to do it, he wanted a visual way to make things because it's just easier sometimes and more fun. Or he probably enjoys doing the math as well, but you know, different techniques can give you different results in the world of sound design and synthesis, so that's why they're there, and he left them there. So there's a few different types of them, and I'm not going to cover each type because it's basically the same idea where you're going to be drawing in your own shapes inside of this visual editor. So let's keep going through this. Let's look at quantize. Let me get the editor off. So let's listen to what this does. So it sounds fairly similar to a sample and hold. You can see here that we're going from a saw, which is generally a very smooth wave, and it's introducing these little ripples at a certain point, and then it's kind of the square pulse look. It's degrading the audio quality, kind of like a bit crusher, but it's obviously not bit crushing the bit. So let's keep going on. Next, you have FM from B. So unless you have oscillator B, this won't do anything. Okay, so you need to have oscillator B active, and now it will do something. It's applying some frequency modulation or a phase modulation-esque type sound to what is in oscillator B. And then you have AM from B. This is the kind of like the. Well, I'll show you before I describe it. So this is an amplitude modulation. Now it's not having a huge effect on it, on a certain wavetable. It will on certain sounds. Maybe not a saw maybe a saw is not the best example, but we'll keep on going here. Next we have ring modulation from B. All right, and then below it we have FM noise from the noise oscillator. So again, this is just like the FM from B, but you need to have your noise oscillator active for it to do anything. So we can turn off oscillator B. So that's what's going on there. And finally, you have FM from sub oscillator. Now this one's a cool one because if you're kind of trying to create like those deep house sounds, let's listen to, let me turn the level down real quick. So here's a sine wave, right? You can kind of start to get those quintessential deep house, garage type sounds that are using a sine wave, typically with some frequency or phase modulation applied to it. So there's a quick rundown of all the different types of warp modes at your disposal in Serum. They're great. I would suggest playing around with them. There's so many, and they're actually all pretty musical to my ear. So let's keep going on to the pan here. Let's listen to what this does. Let me clear this off. So pan, pretty self-explanatory. Pans things left or right in the audio field, or the stereo field. And this level, this is how much of the actual wavetable, when you don't have the filter on, is how loud it'll be. Let me turn off the sub. And when you have a filter, it's going to be how much is being sent out to your filter if you select the input into your filter. All right, so that covers everything in the oscillators inside of Serum. We ran through how to load wavetables, how to use all of the different knobs and all the different settings in it. So that concludes this part of the course. I will see you in part 4.